Welcome everyone. As Marlene said, Steve Culverhouse worked for professional services now for about 12 years. And the purpose of today's call really is just a webinar. It's just to really go over the ARIS Risk and Compliance Manager, the workflow for control testing. There's an associated part of it called control execution as well, which I will cover in detail, both these. It's actually one workflow, but it's like the control execution is an extension of the control testing workflow, but I'll go through it from beginning to end. So let's quickly pop it into slide deck mode and change the display. Okay, so I will first of all give you an overview, a general overview of ARCM and of GRC in general. So, you know, what we call the GRC life cycle. And then I'll look at in ARIS itself, how do we perform the modeling to support the workflows? So we record the risks and controls and we define tests and so on. What models do we use? How do we set it up? And then, of course, I will go on to the ARCM, the ARIS Risk and Compliance Manager, and I will go through these control execution and control testing workflow. Okay, as an example, I'll have two examples, one of each, and I'll walk you through from beginning to end. So how do we perform a control execution, perform a control test, and then how do we then review the results of the control test and see the management information about completed test cases. Okay, so that's kind of the agenda. Probably about 50-50 in terms of slide deck and demonstration on the system. So let's have a look at a general overview then. So I'll start off with this slide. If you joined the previous session on risk management, then apologies, you might well have seen this before, but it is an appropriate place to start. So what we see here is what we call the GRC life cycle. So it starts with a company setting its goals and objectives. And then obviously to achieve your goals and objectives, you've got to identify what risk could impair that. So we identify the risks and then we perform what we call risk assessments. So again, it's covered last time, but this is where we look at a risk and we say, well, what's the likelihood of that occurring? And if it does occur, what's its impact on our objectives, basically? And from that assessment, you can then plot those risks on what we call heat maps to see, you know, if they're in the red area here, they're high risk, high probability, and they're going to need some attention. Obviously, once you've identified your risks, then you're going to respond to them in some way. So responding can be just, well, I'm going to avoid that business activity altogether because I don't want to take that risk. Or it might be building some controls in order to reduce the risk that you're undertaking. You could also you could also transfer the risk. In other words, take out some insurance, etc. Okay, so there's a number of different options, one of which is tolerate as well, of course. Number of different options to how you respond to the risk. So where we do need to implement controls, we can obviously create those controls, and hopefully those controls will help them mitigate either the probability of the risk occurring, or they will reduce the impact should that risk occur, or they may well reduce both. Okay, so we design controls, we implement them, and then of course what we really need to do is make sure that they're effective, so we can then test those controls. Again, that is a workflow within the tool where we can create a task, allocate it to somebody, and they will then be given a task to check that control, test a sample of those controls actually occurring, just to deduce or assess whether those controls actually help mitigate the risk and are they effective. Obviously, from these risk assessments and from these control tests, there may well be actions or remedial action plans that are required to address certain weaknesses that we might find in our framework. And we can then manage those actions or create them and manage them within the GRC tool or within ARCM. There's a workflow called issue management. At some point, there may well be an incident, of course, an incident being a risk that has occurred. We can capture details of that incident in the system, and we can then attribute that incident to, I don't know, a particular process step or related to an organizational unit or an application system. And as losses subsequently materialize, those losses then can be linked to the incident, and those losses can also be linked to the risks or an organizational unit or other artifacts within your database. So we're building up a number of relationships, and we can then analyze that to see where the problems are and what we could do about it. Okay, so that's the incident and loss workflows. Again, workflows within our GRC tool. And then, of course, we can monitor the performance overall. So how well are your processes operating? Are there any risks? What controls have we got over those risks? Have those risks been assessed? What are the results of the control tests and so on? And then from that, obviously from that analysis, we can then decide whether or not we need to adjust our goals and objectives. Okay, and then we go around the loop again. So this is the GRC lifecycle. And as I said, our tool has a number of different workflows that support this lifecycle, of which I'll just mention 2 or 3. So let's just quickly look at the architecture, if you like, of where GRC fits in. So this, if you like, you can ignore this one. This is a legacy. This is probably for more mature areas where we're looking at real-time creation of tasks, which is not usually what people start with. So let's consider this element here. So we've got the ARIS repository, which is your database, and the ARIS enterprise modeling is really the ARIS Connect designer, where we can complete the modeling. So we can create our risks and controls, we can link them to processes, we define processes, we can link them to organizational units, application systems, and so on. So all of that kind of modeling is done in ARIS Connect designer, and it's stored in the ARIS repository. And of course, as you know, if you use Connect, there is this aware dashboarding capability that you have within the tool. So you can see a representation of your processes, the status of those different processes, etc. And again, staff within a business can access this ARIS portal, if you like, in order to view different information about their processes and see certain dashboards apparently as well. Okay, so you've got the modeling capability, the dashboarding, reporting, and of course, the ability for users in the business to see published data. So all of that, if you like, is ARIS Connect. And then over here, what we have is your ARIS Risk and Compliance Manager. So it's a modular part of ARIS, and it will draw its information from the repository. So details of your risk, controls, and the tests that you're going to perform are modeled in here, and we'll come on to that soon. And that all the details are captured in terms of attributes. How often do you want the tests created, etc.? How long do you have to perform the tests once they're created? All of that information is in here, and it will drive these workflows. So the tool pulls the information from the repository, and based on the attributes of your control test definition, it will say, okay, I need to complete or generate a test for this particular control. I need to do it today. And it will generate the test cases, and it will then allocate them to assigned users. Okay, so one of the things I should mention is that your Risk and Compliance Manager tool is a workflow-based tool, obviously, but it's also a role-based tool. So there are a number of predefined roles within the system. So, for example, in our case, what we're talking today about is testers. And there's test reviewers. There's also control execution owners. So these are roles within the system. And basically what we need to do is allocate business users to those roles. And again, we do that in the enterprise modeling in ARIS Connect Designer. And it will generate the tasks, as I say, and allocate the tasks to the assigned users, to the assigned tester or control execution owners, and it will place it in their work queue. They'll receive an email or notification in Outlook to say there's a task in your queue, please action, sign in and action. So in a nutshell, that's basically how it works. And now let's just look at some of the elements that we have, or the workflows that we have available within the tool. So today we're talking about control testing and control executions. But as I say, these in the red box here are all of the different workflows available within ARCM. So around the edge, you've got your modeling and publishing and dashboarding. This is all ARIS Connect. And then obviously we have this, the ARCM represented in the middle. So the most common workflows are your control testing and or operational risk management risk assessments. And then combined with that, you've also got a standard out of the box workflow called issue management, which basically enables you to capture any findings that you might have that need some sort of remedial action. So when you're doing a control test, if there's a weakness, you can raise an issue it's a defined workflow. And again, you capture the details of the problem, and then you allocate it to somebody to take an action forward. So the person that receives it will first of all confirm, yes, this is my responsibility. And then based on their responsibility, they will define a remedial action plan on how to address that weakness. Now, that might be just to implement a new control or something to that effect. So they define what the remedial action is and how long it's going to take. And then they allocate the work, or they potentially do it themselves or allocate it to somebody else. And that work is then, once it's completed, they will then sign off on the system, say, yeah, that's now completed. And we can then check, an issue reviewer will check that and make sure, yes, are we happy with that solution and the implementation? Is it done properly? And if they are, they can close that issue record. But that issue record will forever be linked to that control test case or to the operational risk assessment case that generated that issue. Okay, so there's a linkage between them, an audit trail. Other workflows that I will briefly mention, but I'm not going to spend too much time here. Obviously, I don't want to spend more than another 10 minutes looking at the slide deck. The other workflows are, say, for example, survey management. So you can define questionnaires in the modeling, and you can define survey tasks to pick up those questionnaires and send them to defined users. And those surveys might be around, what controls have you got over data protection within your area of operation, within your process. And it might be something to support the GDPR legislation. So the owner of the process has to answer a series of questions, and then based on that, they might then need to take some sort of action to increase the controls or whatever. Okay, so survey management is a useful tool. Incident and loss I've already touched on. So if a risk occurs, you can raise an incident record in the tool. You can allocate it to somebody to maintain that incident detail and so on. In a similar way, any losses that subsequently occur can be linked back to the incident and can be linked to the risk that ultimately generated it. And you can also make other connections to, affected organizational units or affected application systems or processes and so on. So again, there are workflows in the tool to manage these losses and incidents, record them, check them, have we done it correctly, and so on. Policy management is, obviously, you can record all your internal policies within the tool, and there's about 3 different workflows here. So first of all, you can have a workflow that will say, right, once you've defined your policy, it's going to go to an approver or approvers to check that policy and say, yes, we're happy, and we sign off that policy. And then once they sign it off, it's published. Now, the second one in workflow would be, then you can send out attestations to people that should be following that policy and ask them to confirm that they are in compliance with the policy. And again, that's a workflow, and you can monitor that. And of course, the third policy management workflow would be a regular check of policies documented to make sure they're up to date. So you give a task to somebody to say, this policy, can you just confirm it's up to date? If it's not, they can raise an issue, and they can process an issue through the system to update that policy in the tool, and then get it reapproved and get it republished. So again, some 2 or 3 different workflows in that one policy management workflow. What else? Audit management. You can maintain your audits in the system. You can assign auditors to each audit project. You can break those audits down into individual tasks and assign the resources, as I say. And then you can have a lead auditor that will manage that process within the tool and say, right, make minor changes to the audits, send out the audit tasks, and then the auditors action those tasks and then provide documentary evidence as appropriate. Again, all managed within different workflows, a number of different users, user roles that action it. So you have what they call an audit owner that will act as somebody that reviews the audit and sends out the individual tasks. Then you've got the audit step owners, who would be the auditors that would action the individual tasks and sign off on them. And then you have a reviewer, an audit reviewer, who will check everything once everything's done to make sure they're satisfied with the individual tests and that they're happy with the audit conclusion. So that's audit management in a nutshell. Regulatory change management, same as policy management, but for regulations. So you can record your regulations and you can periodically check them to make sure they're up to date. But you can also have a compliance management element to it. So within any regulation, there are a number of requirements that you must comply with. So you can identify those requirements. You can then define tests to say, right, I'm going to check that area A, B, and C are in compliance with these requirements, and you can define these compliance tests and send them out. But it's similar to control testing in that respect, but it's just really about compliance with regulations. Okay, so I'm not going to carry on with any others. There's a couple more I could mention here, but I think in the interest of time, I think I'll move on. So hopefully that gives you an idea. And so most of these workflows are essentially two stages. So usually there's someone that performs the task, like a test of a control, and then somebody that will review that. Am I in agreement with your conclusion, or do I wish to push it back and ask you to consider something else? So that would apply to risk assessments. It would apply to control testing, incident and loss management. The only probably the one that's slightly different would be the audit management one, because you've got a lead auditor, you've got audit step owners, you've got reviewers, you've got 2 or 3 different roles involved in the workflow. There are also roles in all of these for managers. So you have a test manager, you'll have a control manager, you have a risk manager, and these are roles, predefined roles again, that give you overview of the data that relates to that topic in the system. So you don't actually play a role, an active participant role in the workflow itself, but you can see as a control tester all the controls in the database and all the test results, and have the read access to all the information that relates to those test results. The same for risk assessments if you're a risk manager, and so on. Okay, so moving on. Yeah, so the control testing capability, as I say, you can build an internal control system. You use predefined workflows to trigger these tasks, and notifications get sent out at the same time to the owners of those tasks. You know, you're a tester, you get a test in your work queue, you get an email to say, please sign in and action this test. And again, once the test is done, and it passes to the reviewer will then get a notification to say, and there's a task that's been completed, ready for your review. Okay. I'll come on to the distinction between control tests and executions in a moment. So modeling data, again, quickly on this one, your principal model is your business controls diagram. And in this model, you can represent your risk. You can say, well, what control or controls, because there might be multiple controls, help mitigate this risk. So in this case, there's one risk, it's only got one control. But this control has got 2 different tests. Now, this might be a test of design. So is the control appropriately designed? Have we got the right activities in the test? Is it performed by the right person or the right role? And is it done at the appropriate time intervals? So that might be, you know, what we're looking for when we do a control design test. On the other hand, the effectiveness test might say, well, you know, we're looking at this control from the point of view, does it actually help mitigate this risk? And we'll look at, you know, at different aspects of, is the control performed as it should be done in the time frames it should be done? Are you executing it as defined? But not only that, it might then take a sample and look further into it. Have we got supporting evidence that this was done, and that you've got different logs and so on available to you to check that things were performed as they should be? So it's a little bit more of an in-depth review of the control to make sure that it is effective in mitigating the particular risk. And as you see down here, if you see down here, so a risk control and tests Each test is associated with a particular organizational unit. So this control test affects this organizational unit. And then, of course, more importantly, for the workflows point of view, this test is performed by this tester group, and the tester reviewer group is also assigned. So there'll be an individual or individuals in each group. And once a test is generated, all those that are in that group, the tester group, will receive a notification and the task goes into their workflow. Any one of them can action it. Whoever actions it first would lock that record to themselves, so the others only have read access, not write access. And then once they've finished, it then goes to the reviewer and they check to make sure they're happy with the response and conclusion of the test. Now, it should be said that out of the box, only control tests that fail will go to the reviewer. But you can change that with parameters in the administration of the ARCM. So you could, if you wanted all tests to go to the reviewer, even those that pass, then you could actually change that parameter, and that would make them go to the reviewer as well. And that's it. So that's the main model that drives this. And of course, behind this control test, there'll be attributes of that says, well, what activities do I need to perform to undertake a test of that control? When do I want to start these tests? And what frequency do I want them done? Okay, so all of those are attributes, and we'll look at that in a moment. Other models that are relevant, so the risk can be related to your process steps within a business process, as could the control. So you could also link the control to a process step as well, if you wish, in either EPC models, a BPMN model, or the function allocation diagram can also be used. Risk can also be part of a risk categorization structure. So this risk might be part of your finance category. Again, models used to just categorize the risks and group them. But more importantly, I think for this exercise, again, this organizational structure here is referring to what we call an authorization diagram. So for these tester groups and test reviewer groups, we have to say, okay, who belongs to these groups? So this is where we say we have a tester group for sales, we have a tester group for finance, we have a tester group for IT, perhaps. What you call them is entirely up to you, and how you group them entirely up to you. But just using those as examples, then you might have different individuals that are assigned to the finance and sales and IT tester groups, as you might have different people in the reviewer groups as well. Okay, so this is the model we use, organizational structure. And again, I'm going to jump on the system and show you briefly in a moment, so I won't labor this too much. In terms of roles, I think I've already probably covered this. So in terms of this workflow, we have testers and test reviewers. There's a test manager as well that would have oversight of all your results for testing and all the objects that are related to that test. So which control, which risk, and so on. And the control execution, there is a control execution owner role, and there's a control manager role as well that can oversee control executions. So again, that's pretty much all I need to say. So a little bit of definition. I can make this pack available to everybody as well. So a little bit of definition about what the roles are, and what they can do and what they can access within each role. Okay. Object specific just means that as a tester, you only see or have access to those tests to which you are physically connected in modeling. Whereas an environment role means that you can have access to everything of that type in the database, in the ARCM. So if you're a test manager in an environment level, you will see all tests in the database, regardless whether those tests relate to controls about sales, about finance, about IT. You'll see everything. Whereas if you are object-specific test manager for sales, you would only see the sales-related tests, because you have an object in modeling that's physically linked to those test cases. So that's the difference between object and environment. Okay, so this is the model for, this is the model for allocating business users to predefined roles. So we have a number of roles here. So this is tester group for sales, for example. And if you look at the attributes of that object, you can see that there's under risk and compliance, you've got something called the ARIS risk and compliance role, and it's down as tester. So this is what tells the system that anybody attached to this group, give them the permissions and the responsibility of a tester group. So give them everything they need to do to perform the tester role. So in this case, Tom's attached to the group, so Tom is a tester for sales. In fact, in this case, Tom's a tester in each of these groups, but in reality, they'd probably be different people. But this is how we allocate business users, person objects, to a role object, and that role object has an attribute that defines which role is undertaken. You can have multiple people in a group. So as I said, if there are multiple people, then whoever picks that role at first, that task at first, will lock it to themselves, and the others won't be able to action it. You can also have, an individual can also belong to multiple groups. So Tom, in this case, is a member of all of these groups, but he might also be a risk assessor or an incident owner or whatever. So that's perfectly okay, as long as there's no conflict or segregation of duties issue. So Tom could not be, for example, a tester for group sales and a test reviewer for group sales, because it needs to be an independent individual that would take on the reviewer role in that case. So as long as there's no segregation of issues, you can be in multiple groups, but segregation of issues is one of those red lines that the system will actually prevent that from occurring. It will identify that this user is assigned to the reviewer and the tester role. In this case, that's not allowed. Okay, so that's that. So let's talk about control executions and control tests. So what is the difference? So control executions are, well, not new to the scene. They've been around for several years now, but certainly control tests came first. So originally we had just control tests, and then they extended control tests to include what they call control executions. So now you have a separate symbol that's used for a control execution. It's this one here. And basically it's considered an extension to the test management workflow. It's not a separate module. So in the control execution, as it says here, the user simply confirms if a control has been executed in line with the instructions and the frequency. So if you've got a monthly control, then basically, and you do this control execution test quarterly, then you will have 3 examples of that control supposedly being executed. And what you're doing is checking, well, did it get executed each month as it's supposed to, or did they miss a month? And as I say, as it says here, the results of these executions can then inform the control tests as well, because that might be something you want to know in a control test. But rather than going searching for that information yourself in a control test, if you've got executions established that operate on a regular basis, then you can look at the results of the control executions to find that information. They're typically performed by users within an operational area, so each are like a local QA function. So if you've got a finance team that's or finance area that's performing certain activities, and there's a series of controls that's supposed to occur on a daily basis, a weekly or monthly basis, or whatever, then you can define control executions, and perhaps a local QA team will just run them on a quarterly basis to say, right, this control was supposed to have occurred on a daily basis for the last so many weeks. So I'm expecting to see, 24, 25 examples of this occurring over this period. And they can then check, well, how many times did it actually operate? And in fact, they only operated it 20 times. Why not the additional 5? So you can get this is the purpose of it, just to record how often these controls are run, and also whether they were done correctly. Did they identify a problem? And then the other thing to say about this is that they're not mandatory. So as I said before, we used to have control testing without control exceptions. So you don't have to use them, but it's another option. If you want to, you can implement them. And in terms of control executions that are done automatically by other systems, so sometimes you might have an automated control that is recorded in another system. So what you can do via APIs is pull in that information from the other systems and automatically create completed control execution cases and link them to that control. So it's providing the evidence that that control has been exercised automatically as it's supposed to have been done over a particular period. And those activities stay with the control, and they can be used, as I said, as evidence when you're doing your control tests later. So here's an example. So if you have, and I think we're going to use this in the system, an accurate preparation of pre-tax income is the risk. The control is an accountant, a senior accountant, reviews and approves this calculation on a monthly basis. And it's also checked by the tax department as well. So if you have your control execution document, what you're essentially looking for is how many times should this pre-tax income calculation should have been executed, and in fact, how many times was that check performed? And the other one is of the times it was performed, how many were correct, how many were found to be correct, and how many were found to be incorrect? And is there any reason for that? So can you explain the deviation? So that just before, as I say, provides a record then each month, each quarter, or whenever it's scheduled, of whether these controls are executed as they should have done and whether they're done correctly and did they find an issue. Control tests, on the other hand, again, typically performed by like a central compliance team or a risk function or indeed internal audit perhaps. And there's two types of tests. There's your test of design and there's your test of effectiveness. So the design, as I said before, is really looking at does the check or does the control include the right activities? Is it performed by the right person or the right role? And is it done at the appropriate time periods? So if not, then it might need to be revised. The effectiveness, on the other hand, is basically to assess if the control is effective or not effective. And I think I've changed that wording now to passed or failed in mitigating a specific risk. So involves confirming not only the correct execution for which you can rely on your control execution tests, but it also involves more detailed sampling and analysis of reperformance. So taking the same risk, for example, and same control, so this inaccurate calculation, basically, you're doing a check on a monthly basis to make sure it's accurate, or rather someone's checking it each month and you've annotated the fact that they've checked it. But now what we want to do is say, right, we need a list of authorized signatories. Let's get the monthly pre-tax income calculation, and let's check whether this calculation was reviewed and approved as it should have been, for which you can rely on your control executions, of course. And then you're going to compare the signatory with the list of authorized signatories. So the person that signed off the check, are they actually authorized to do so? So not only not just check, yes, somebody signed it, that's fine. It's actually, were they the right person? Let's check back against a documented list of authorized signatories. And then also the calculation itself. Does the calculation, let's see how the calculation is done, and is that in line with the firm's tax guidelines? So we're going a lot, as you can see, we're going a lot deeper than just saying, yes, that check was done, it's signed off, and they identified that 1 month was inaccurate. It goes a lot further than that. But as I say, you can rely on the results of the executions to inform your control test to a certain degree. So just very quickly in terms of the attributes, and I'm going to do a demonstration. So we've got your BCD model where we're recording the risks and the controls and the tests. But as you can see here, we've got this other object, this control execution object. So unlike the control test, which has a tester and then someone to check it, but only checking those that have failed, as I say, the control execution, basically, it just needs someone to perform that control execution to confirm the control works. It's been undertaken in line with what the periods it should have been undertaken or frequencies. But there is no reviewer of this. So once you've done your record, once you've completed your task, then that just becomes a record that's associated to the control, and it can be referenced later on when we do our control testing. Okay. In terms of the attributes, you will see the control execution. It tells you what are your activities you're doing. It'll also say when do you want to start this from, how often you want this to be performed, how long you have to perform the test once it's generated. And this is your period that you're looking at historically, the control period you're looking at. You're doing it for the last quarter. And that's essentially it. And it's the same attributes for the control testing. So the control testing says what activities you're going to undertake, whether it's a control effectiveness test or a design test, and then obviously these attributes that drive the workflow. So when do you want it to start? How often do you want it done? How long have you got to do it? Okay, so there's a couple of other attributes in here as well, like follow-up. So if your control test failed, then you can generate a follow-up that's linked to the original failure, so that after you've done your action plan to resolve the failure, you can generate a follow-up case and then just check it back against the original one. So yes, I'm happy. We found it didn't work. We've taken an action plan. I can see the complete action plan, and now I'm happy to confirm that this test is fine now in the follow-up. And the other one is this event-driven event-driven control test allowed. All that is basically, if you want to be able to generate a test outside of this quarterly period, as long as this attribute is checked, then a test manager role could generate an ad hoc test case. If it wasn't checked and you tried to generate a test case, it wouldn't allow it. Okay, so that said, I think now what I'd like to do is just summarize the workflows. And then I'll jump onto the system and show you. So as I said here, the system will automatically generate the task based on your attributes in the modeling. So you set it monthly and it starts from the first of each month. So the first of each month, it will generate a test case. If event-driven cases are allowed, then the manager can also initiate that and it will generate the case for them as well. Once it's generated, it goes to the tester. The tester then will either decide it's as in passed or failed now, I think they call it. If it's out of the box and you haven't touched those parameters, only the not effective one will go to the reviewer, and they can reject it back if they don't agree. If they reject it, it takes the status off. If they accept it, then fine, it will just carry on. You'll decide then whether you wish to create an issue. So you've said, I agree, it's not effective. So what are you going to do about it? Is it self-correcting and you think, okay, I don't need to take any action, it will resolve itself next month? Or do I need to have some sort of action or remediation plan that needs to be introduced? So if they raise an issue, then obviously that's another workflow, and that's a managed workflow. Once they've raised the issue, that's managed separately, but linked to the case. And then once they close the record, then obviously it then goes into this monitoring where the results are available in the MI part of the tool, which is called the evaluation module. On the other hand, if it's not effective, if it is effective or is the control test passed, then it just goes straight into monitoring and it doesn't go to the reviewer, unless you change the parameter in the administration section to say, I want all past tests also to go to the reviewer. So that's the test management workflow. The other workflow is basically a little bit simpler. So again, once the system generates it based on your parameters that you set, automatically generates it, puts it in the control execution owner's queue, and they basically complete the 4 fields, and then it's attached to that control as a reference, and it's available for anybody to see. And that's basically it. So let me close this and go over to the system. So I'm going to log in as Tom Owen into ARIS Connect. I will just briefly show you the modeling, but I'm going to go the last 20 minutes really to just show you the workflow. So the modeling looks something like this. So in terms of my favorites, I've got my business controls diagram. So here's the risk, here's the controls, and as I said earlier, you've got the test plan. This is what they call a test definition that defines how we're going to test this plan, test this control. And if I hover over it, I can access what they call the fact sheet. And in here, I can see things like, okay, what's the testing activities that I need to undertake? What are the connected objects, the connected control? Which organization does it affect? who's going to perform the test, sorry, is up here. Who's going to perform the test and who's going to review it. And then over here, you've got the frequencies. How often is it going to be generated? Quarterly? How long have they got to do it once it's generated? 90 days, and so on. So all the attributes that drive the workflow. The other model probably I should show you is again, very quickly, is the authorization diagram. So this here, the only thing I really want to show you on this one is if I highlight the role, you can see down here that it's a tester role. This one is a reviewer role. So highlighting, you can see it's test reviewer. And as I say, this is what shows or tells the system that anybody that's attached to me, give them permissions to do the reviewer role or the tester role. It's as simple as that. Okay, so I think with time in mind, I'm going to move on now to the actual workflow itself. So I'm signed in as Tom. Tom is a tester. So I'm going to go to his GRC tasks. And down here, I get a list of all his tasks that he's got. So he's actually got different roles. So not only is he a tester, he's a risk assessor and so on. So if I can filter, just looking for, I'm going to do control executions first. So I'm looking for control executions. And I apply the filter. Okay, and just close that. Now I'm looking for a particular one. Yeah, so here we are. So in the slide deck, I talked about this risk, pre-tax income calculation. So again, this is a control execution task. And again, he would have received a notification in the email to say there's a task, please log into your system and execute this task. And when he opens the task, he will see the record. So first of all, what are the activities I need to undertake? I've also got a link to the control that it relates to. So again, if I click on there, I go to the control, it tells me the details about the control. And then obviously what I've got to do is say, well, how many times is this control, or how many times should it have operated in the period we're under review? So this execution is generated quarterly. And I think that the control itself operates monthly. So I should have 3 tasks to review. But let's say that I can't find evidence of 3 tasks. I can find evidence of 2. Okay, so it looks like we've missed 1 task, 1 execution. Okay, so I can make a note and make that a bit more extensive if I need to. So I did do some investigation. Then the other thing I do is you need to do is of those, how many were found to be correct? So, you know, what was the calculation correct or not? So in this case, let's say that, yeah, 2 were and none were. So, oh, I'm not sure if that works. Let's just say 1 and 1. Just to give you an example. I don't know. And again, I've made some notes here, right? So I found that one of the executions identified a calculation that wasn't done correctly. And I save it. And then what I have then is a completion and a deviation rate. So what we see then is the completion rate was that, you know, 66%. So it should have been 100%, but obviously we missed 1. So that equates to 33.33%. And the deviation rate is how many times was it done correctly? It was only done correctly once out of the 2 that we found. So it's a deviation rate of 50 in this case. Okay, and that is basically as complicated as it gets. So once I've put my figures in, I can put any comments in accordingly, and I can set the status. And I also have the ability to add documentation if I wish to as well. So if there's something that I found I wish to add as evidence, I can either add a document link, in which case I just say, okay, choose a file. I can save the document on my computer. I can choose a file, and I can just add a file to the system. Give it a description if I wish to, and it adds that file. Alternatively, I can simple link. I can just say, right, create a simple link. And I don't know, just for demonstration, I'm just going to say, internet link, and I'm just going to use MSN as an example because it's nice and short. Okay, so then it basically adds my evidence to it, and if I link on that, it will take me to MSN. Or if it will click this, it'll open the document for me. So those are forever linked to this test case as evidence. Once I'm completed, I set my status, and now I can save it. And that is it, really. So if I was to look at the control, on a control, you will see that there's assigned objects, one of which is control executions. And you can see I've got 4 completed executions. So these are undertaken on a quarterly basis, and those deviation and completion rates are recorded down for me as well. So these basically would be evidence when we do a later control test to say how often was that control executed, and did it find issues in the execution of that in the execution of that control. Yeah, so was the calculation incorrect, or was it correct? So that's the evidence. That's where I can find it. There is no second part to that. So the control execution part now is gone. So, okay, I'm back at this task list here. So the execution that I just performed is now no longer in this task list. It's now completed. And I'll just simply go on to my next task. Okay. So I'm just going to, let me just close out of that. So that was a control execution. Now, if I want to go, again, I'm accessing GRC tasks from Connect here. I wanted to do it that way. So now let's assume that I'm logged in as Tom, and I want to go to my control execute. I want to go to my control tests. So again, I'm in my GRC tasks. This time, I just do a filter for my tests. Sorry, I think it's thrown me out. Let me do that again. So logged in as Tom. Already at my GRC task list. As I said, I'm going to filter for control tests. And I'm just going to look for the same. There we go. So it's the same. It's a test for the same control. So this review pre-tax income calculation. So again, it opens a case record for me. Again, I would have received a text message. Sorry, I would have received an email notification to say there's a test ready for you to action. And again, once I open the task, I can see again, I've got a link to the control. I've got details of what activities I need to perform. So in this case, you can see, you know, not only am I just checking that it's been performed, I'm also obtaining other relevant information. So I'm getting the authorized signatory list. I'm going to check who signed off on those tasks against, on those checks, sorry, against who's on the signatory list. Is it the right person? I'm going to understand whether the calculation is actually performed correctly, not only that it was done, but is the calculation right? Are we using the right calculation based on the firm's tax guidelines? So there's a lot of other tests that I'm doing here, but I can, as I say, refer to the lists of control executions. So, okay, sorry, let me do it another way. So when I go to the control, I would look at the assigned objects to the control, of which the control executions, I should have a series of them. And I've got all the ones that were done in the last year here, actually. So I can see the results, I can open them up, and I can see any comments, any attached documents, etc. So that helps inform my control test that I'm going to perform now. Okay, so I'm back at the control test. These are the tests that I'm going to perform. I can also see other information. So I know it's a test of effectiveness. I know that I'm going to perform this by examination of documentation. So, you know, other types of tests are basically I can watch somebody doing the test. I can observe somebody. I can reperform that test, or I could just ask a series of questions. But in this case, it's the type where I do examination of documentation. This is where a tester could actually add recommendations if they wanted, but we tend not to use this because we have an issue management workflow which is managed, whereas this isn't a managed workflow. So quite often we're asked to remove this section. And of course, on the front page here, on the task page, we've got ultimately the status. So are we going to pass it, fail it, or could we say for some reason it wasn't possible to perform the test? Okay, so again, we've got boxes here to, in this case, it's an effectiveness test. So once I've done the test, I can add in my own comments here. I can also add documents to support my conclusion. On the next tab, we've also got information about the test. So what's the testing period? What's the control period we're looking at historically? How often the control is performed as well, and links to the risk and the test definition from which this test was created. And of course, what are the other information that is connected to. So in this case, it's connected to this control is connected to a particular process, and also who's going to perform the test and who's going to review it. Lists as well, okay, about surveys and questionnaires that are performed related to this control. If there was any issues raised, or if I raise an issue later, then it will be stored here. And the log tab this is optional. This could actually be removed, but it's again, every time you update this record, it creates a new version, and those versions are available in the log tab. At the moment, we've only got the one version. So let's assume now that I've done the work, I've followed these instructions, I've reviewed documentation, and now I'm happy to say that test failed. So I'm picking failure so that you can see it go to the review. So the other thing I need to say is, did the control frequency meet expectations? Did they operate this control in line with the defined frequency? And I might say yes, they did, because I can look at the control executions to inform me. Okay. Add any comments under this one, which is now mandatory. You notice the red dot because it is an effectiveness test, so it's a mandatory field to complete. And then add any documents. And then once I'm happy, I can save it. It tells me it's finished, and that task has now left my queue, and it's available for action by the reviewer. So if I sign out of here, I'm just going to sign in as the reviewer, a guy called Mike. And if I filter the list for test cases, here's my test, it's just completed. Now I can see down here, for example, that it's been completed by Tom, and the status is, where is it? This test has failed. I've got any comments that he's made. Of course, I've got access to all the lists about, if I go to the control, I can access the list of control test executions and so on. I've got any documents that Tom might have added, should be down here if he's added any. And of course, then, you know, I can then decide whether or not ultimately I'm going to accept or reject. If I reject, it takes off this status and sends it back to the tester. On the other hand, if I'm happy, then I accept it and it saves that test for me. So one thing I didn't do, so sorry about that, is I've said it's a failed test, and basically I agree. So what are you going to do? So I can either raise an issue, a deficiency, or nothing. Well, deficiency is like, this is a very complicated issue form specifically relating to Sarbanes-Oxley type issues. So typically we only use either none or issue. So if you want to raise an issue, then basically I can now save this. And when I save it, it's now completed it, but it's saying, what do you want to do? Do you want to go to that open issue and create it? Or do you want to go back to the test case? So in this case, I'm going to go to the open issue. You can see that it automatically puts some narrative in here, but I can feel free to, you know, update this with a description of what the problem was. But you can also see, I can put a priority, and also I can see that it's linked to the test case. So this is, again, forever linked to this particular test case. So if I'm happy with that, all I need to do is say, right, who am I going to assign as owner? So let's say that I'm going to assign Kim. And then I've got to say, well, who's going to check this once it's done? Now, maybe I raised it. I want to see that it's completed satisfactorily. So I'm going to put myself as a reviewer. Now, any company will probably have their own policies about who should be allocated as owners and who should review it. But just for sake, I'm just randomly pick Kim, and I'm going to review it because I raised this issue. And once I'm happy, so I've defined what the problem is, I've given it a status, I've allocated who I think is responsible for it, and then I'm just going to say, right, I've registered that risk. And once I save it, it's now registered and it's been sent as a task to Kim. Okay, so back on the test case, you can see that I've raised an issue. Now, I think if I look in here, now that I've raised an issue on this test case, under issues, I can see this issue case available. I can see who raised it. I can see that it's not actually completed or nothing's been done on it at the moment. And it's currently, if I was to open it up, I'd see that it's been allocated to Kim. Okay, now there's no action plan in there at the moment. It's just raised an issue. It'll be up to Kim to say, yes, that is me, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to resolve that, and I'm going to do it by a certain time. And then the workflow continues. But I'm not going to go and show you that workflow because that's taking too long. So you can see that I've raised an issue. It's linked to the action plan. And then as I go down here, you can see that I've accepted it as a reviewer, and that's it. So this case is now completed for me, although there's an open issue that's being worked. But for my task, I've done my review of that. So that's the case where you've now completed a control execution task. I've completed a deeper control evaluation for the effectiveness assessment of that control. And where we'll find this now will be under the evaluation section, where we have effectively our results. So we have different, this guy, Mike, is also an audit manager. He's a risk manager, survey manager. But obviously, if we want to see the results of test management, we need to go to the test manager one, and we can look at control tests. And under here, you can see that I've got different options depending on how I want to see the results split by. So, for example, I can see the results for tests split across the database by organization, by process, by risk category, and so on. Okay, so I've got a lot of choice here, but let's just take processes, for example. Now, it's the same format for all. So if I just expand all here, you can see that it brings up the process hierarchy underneath. And then it shows me for each area, basically what or how many risks we've got, and how many test cases have been generated and what their status is. So manage the configuration process. If you like, we've got 6 cases, one of which is in the status new. 5 have not been tested, so they're still awaiting testing. Over here, for example, under monthly closing, we've got a more varied. We've got 29 that are not tested, 1 that's passed, and 6 that failed. Okay, so we can click on any one of these and we can get a list of what they are, and we can go and have a look at them. But again, if I want to look at the end, and I'm going to pick the highest level here so that I get all of them. If I just click on the chart here, it just gives us an overview of the statuses of all the tests we've got at the moment. So 46 have not been tested because this is just a test system. We don't use it every day, and they expire. We've got 7 that are passed, 8 that have failed, and 10 that are still open awaiting action. These ones that are not tested, what happens is the system will get to a point in time, and after which it will just close that record automatically and give it a status of not tested. All right, so that's how you see your results, and they are aggregated up. So if you can see here, under monthly closing, you've got 41. Well, that consists of these 3 sub-departments, 15, 18, and 8 equals 41. There's only, under executing closing, there's only monthly closing, so 41 again. So it just aggregates up. And as I say, it's the same for each of these, same format for each of these, just looking at a different hierarchy to see your results. In a similar manner, well, just one other thing on control testing. If I pick on the forecast, we can also see, I need to be in another user for this. I need to be a manager role for that one. But for control executions, we've got the same sort of thing, I think. Again, for applications here, just an example. Again, it will tell you how many control executions you've got within each area, or in this case, for each application. What's the number that are new, what status they're in, completed, and so on. And again, a pie chart to show you the results. So similar results available for control tests and for control executions. I'm going to very quickly sign out as this guy and sign in as a manager role, and then I'm basically finished. So as a manager role in evaluations, you also have the ability to see the forecasts. So this basically, for each of the groups, each of the tester groups you've got, it says how many test definitions have you got and how many are going to be generated in the period you're looking at. Okay, so we're only looking at the last quarter, but if I change this to 2025, for example, apply the filter, it's now looking ahead for a year and a quarter, and it's saying, okay, over that period, the finance group will have 41 tests that are going to be generated, and they fall within these months. And the same for each group. So it's a good way to, manage your business. You know how many tests are coming up, and you know the individuals in here. Maybe some of these guys are going to be on holiday, so you might have to redistribute some of the tests and so on. Okay, so that's all from the evaluation point of view. The only other thing I wanted to show you briefly is the ability to extract this information from what they call dashboard feeds. So again, all these results of control tests and risk assessments and everything else are available for extraction from the tool. And if I click on this dashboard links, it's categorized. So for control testing, for example, there's all these basically buckets of information. So if I pick one, so I don't know, control test stuff. No, yeah, this one. So this is telling me what are the attributes I'd get out of the system if I was to pick this one. Maybe this one, better. So it tells me what attributes the system will give me. And basically, I can set certain parameters to say, well, I can only want these ones from certain dates or whatever. And then I can generate a data feed. And if I just copy that and put it in another browser, you can see that it's going to give me a flat file of information. Now this can and is used as data in a dashboard data feed. So we can take this information out in a CSV file and put it as a data feed into a dashboard to populate the results of controlled tests or risk assessments or whatever it is that we're looking at. And these feeds can also be combined together to, using common fields in order to get the data that you need and then use it in the dashboards. Or alternatively, I could copy this into an Excel spreadsheet, a text to columns, and I'd see the data there as well. But it's just another way to extract the data. But I think, again, with the time now, we're over time again. I think that's really it that I'd like to show you. So you've seen an end-to-end of how you set it up. You've seen the workflows in operation, and I've showed you where you access the results in the evaluations and how you extract the data.